and I'm going to record this webinar. Okay, it is 4:02 right now. I'm going to give people 1 more minute. So at 4:03, I'll kick us off and get us started. And everyone can feel free to be on camera, be off camera, whatever you want. Later in the webinar, we'll have like a question and answer session. It'd be lovely to see some faces then, but up to you. Hi, Sally. Okay, it is 4:03, so I'm going to get us started. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Audrey Glendenning, and I am the Grassroots Advocacy Manager at Great Broads for Wilderness. And today we're here to learn about the Greater Sage-Grouse Draft Management Plan. Just a couple of reminders. Please make sure your microphone is muted so we don't have background noise during our presentation. And if you have questions, you can save them for the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. And during that opportunity, you can raise your hand and speak, or you can put something in the chat. So just a little bit of background to get us started. The Bureau of Land Management, BLM, is revising its Greater Sage-Grouse conservation strategy by amending over 70 resource management plans across Western states. And they're considering designating areas of critical environmental concern, and we call these ACECs. And these designations are an important tool that BLM has for protecting places with rare, important plant and wildlife habitat or cultural or scenic values. And once an area is designated as an ACEC, the agency is required to manage it to protect and enhance those values. And the BLM is asking for public comments on ACEC designation as part of its Greater Sage-Grouse conservation strategy. And that's what we're here to discuss today. This will be an informational webinar presentation and a comment writing workshop. So our presentation today is structured in a way to provide you with information so that you can write a comment about the importance of ACEC designation to Greater Sage-Grouse conservation. So first, we will listen to a presentation delivered by Sage-Grouse expert Vera Smith, and then we will spend time together writing comments that you can submit to the BLM after the webinar or continue to work on a little bit, up to you. And then during that comment writing block, that's when we'll have the opportunity to ask questions. And before we get started, I'll introduce Vera. So Vera Smith is a senior federal lands policy analyst at Defenders of Wildlife. She works to defend, strengthen, and expand federal policies that improve wildlife conservation and recovery on federal lands. Before joining Defenders, Vera served as the National Forest Planning and Policy Director at the Wilderness Society. Prior to that, she directed the Wilderness Society's Recreation Planning Program and the Colorado Mountain Club's Conservation Department. She began her public lands career as a ranger and geologist with the National Park Service, where she specialized in land and water restoration. I'm very lucky to call Vera a friend and a mentor. Before I joined the broad staff, I worked with Vera on the federal lands team at Defenders of Wildlife. And while I was there, she introduced me to the crazy world of grouse management. So when this draft plan came out, I went straight to her for advice. She is an amazing resource, and I'm very glad that she's here to join us today. So now I will pass the mic to Vera, and she's going to share her presentation with us.
Thank you so much, Audrey. I'm lucky enough that Audrey and I got to work together a little bit at Defenders, and now we get to work together in our new position at Great Old Broads. I'm a huge fan of Great Old Broads, and I am so pleased to have this opportunity to chat with you guys today and to share a little bit of my knowledge around greater sage-grouse and Bureau of Land Management Planning, and then hopefully having a chance to have a conversation with all of you about the topic and the current planning process. So I put together a slideshow because I think it's way more fun to look at the pictures of beautiful sagebrush and sage-grouse than to look at me. So I am going to share my screen with you. Bear with me for a moment. Look good?
Yeah, that looks great.
Awesome. So as Audrey said, I work with Defenders of Wildlife. I've been with Defenders for almost 5 years. I'm a senior policy analyst, and my job at Defenders is to lead our public lands portfolio. So anything Bureau of Land Management oriented, and in particular, I really focus on that nexus of imperiled species and public lands. There we are. A little bit of maneuvering here. Screens, there we are. So this is what we're going to go cover today. I want to start with giving you guys a general overview of greater sage-grouse biology, and then an overview of what we call the sagebrush sea, which is where the greater sage-grouse lives. And you can see on the map on the right the areas in blue and green. That's sort of the larger extent of the sagebrush sea. And then I want to talk about greater sage-grouse conservation and what's happened in the past and where we are now. And then, as Audrey explained, we're really going to hone in on this one idea or this one concept of areas of critical environmental concern and their potential to help conserve and recover the greater sage-grouse. And then we'll end with some comment writing and using our voice to hopefully help determine the future of the sage-grouse. So that's my plan today. Okay, so I want to start with greater sage-grouse biology. I think that the thing, if you're going to remember anything about the greater sage-grouse, is it requires large, intact sagebrush-dominated landscapes with minimal disturbances, and that within those larger sagebrush landscapes, the seasonal components or the seasonal needs of the greater sage-grouse are met. So greater sage-grouse, they're this absolutely beautiful bird. In early spring, the males go to these places that we call leks. They're mating areas, and they're sort of bald spots on the landscape. And you can see on the top right are males on the lek. And the males go and dance around and strut and try to attract the females. And the females come from the surrounding lands and come and mate. And then after they've mated, they go and they nest. So they go away from the lek, sort of, you can imagine the lek is the center point, and then they're going outside in a circle surrounding the lek. They nest. They want to find places to nest underneath nice sagebrush where there's good grass cover, so the nests are hidden away from predators, and where there's good forage diversity, like flowers on as well as grasses, for that, so that it supports a lot of diverse insects that provide them nutrition. After the birds have had the chicks have hatched, they can live in those nests for a while, but eventually as those upland areas get dry, they try to seek out wetter areas where there are also good insects to eat, because those young chicks need all that nutrition to get big and be able to prepare for winter. So on the bottom right photograph, you can see water in the background and some chicks. And then as winter comes, the sage-grouse, they can migrate some distances, maybe 10 to 20 miles on average. Some do, some don't, but they want to find places where sagebrush sticks up above the snow, because in the wintertime, that's what they need to eat. They pretty much primarily eat sagebrush and survive throughout the winter on that. So that's what the sagebrush need. But again, top need is they need this large, extensive, uninterrupted, healthy, intact sagebrush ecosystems. So the greater sage-grouse, it's been on the radar of biologists and conservationists for decades. People have known that they've been in decline. There are stories 150 years ago of clouds of sage-grouse across the sagebrush landscapes. We don't see that anymore. There's been quite a lot of scientific interest in the greater sage-grouse because people know that it's been in decline. And that research has told us that what we're seeing is about 80% decline since the 1960s, and that decline is accelerating. So in the last 2 decades, we've seen a 41% decline. And if you look across the entire range, 87% of the range since 2002 has been in decline. So there are a few places where sage-grouse are steady or improving, but for the most part, almost 90% across the range, they are not. And the reason, click the slide here. Bit of an odd delay on my computer when I click the slide, so bear with me. This is an interesting map. It's showing the average annual rate of change in greater sage-grouse between 2002 and 2021, so approximately the last 2 decades. And any of the places that are in blue or green are basically holding steady or slightly improving, and any of the other places are in decline. The primary reason for this decline is habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. So again, I started, and I'll keep repeating it, that the sage-grouse need these large landscapes of sagebrush-dominated ecosystems that are in pretty good condition. And as we build things like oil and gas wells, roads, power lines, towns, farms, all sorts of stuff, that landscape gets eaten up. And when that happens, the sage-grouse decline. And so these photographs, I love these photographs. I think they just show the diversity of the sagebrush sea, the habitat that the name that we lovingly call this beautiful habitat that stretches across our interior west. You can, on the top left, you can see the forbs and grasses amongst the sagebrush. It's absolutely beautiful landscape. The BLM manages about 43% of the current extent of the sagebrush systems. And this map it gives you a view into that. So the dark green places on this map are the sagebrush ecosystems that the Bureau of Land Management manages. And the light green are the places that are sagebrush, but not managed by the BLM. And that 43% is a significant amount of habitat and really tells us that the decisions that the Bureau of Land Management makes in how it manages this landscape are really influential in the future, for the future of the greater sage-grouse. So the other thing about the sagebrush sea, you often hear this, is that it's home to a host of other animals. It has hundreds of species that are listed as species of conservation concern. And here's just a few of them. I might point out in the top left corner is the pygmy rabbit. The pygmy rabbit, it's this tiny little rabbit. It fits into the palm of your hand. And it shares very much a similar habitat distribution as the greater sage-grouse, and it too is declining. The pygmy rabbit was petitioned by Defenders of Wildlife, Western Watersheds, and other organizations last year, and it just made it past the 90-day finding with Fish and Wildlife Service, and so it's in process where Fish and Wildlife Service is deciding whether it merits listing. So I talked a little bit, I said that the reason we're seeing the greater sage-grouse declines is because of habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. The greater sage-grouse habitats are now about half of what they historically were. And that habitat continues to shrink. The USGS put out a study in 2022 where they looked at how intact the habitat was. And one of their conclusions was that in recent years, we've lost about 1.3 million acres per year on average of sagebrush dominated habitats. There are lots of reasons. I sort of rattled off a list just a moment ago on energy development, mining, grazing, roads, rights of way. Invasive species is a real issue for our sagebrush habitats, our sagebrush ecosystems, and for greater sage-grouse and the other species that live there. I'm sure you've all heard about cheatgrass and Medusa head. These grasses are spreading across the Western United States, more prevalently in the drier places, like in the Great Basin region, but they're slowly crawling across the landscape. Right now, about 15% of greater sage-grouse habitats are dominated by invasive grasses. So these maps are maps that show this. Defenders put these together last year using BLM data. And on the left, you can see in 1992 that there wasn't that much invasive grass. And then as you look in 2022, you can see these dark green areas and olive green areas that show how much the invasive grasses have spread across the Western United States. The olive green color are BLM lands. We're also seeing drought across the interior West. I'm sure you're all aware of this. Climate change is having an impact. We mapped by county, we mapped the counties that are experiencing what we would call chronic drought. So between 2018 and 2022, if they ticked a certain level on the drought meter, then they were in drought. And the darker the red, the more years a county has experienced drought within that 5-year window. The black line shows the greater sage-grouse range perimeter. So you see drought is having a significant impact. And with that comes fire, right? And so what we find ourselves in is this crazy sort of loop where we get these invasive grasses that dry up before the native grasses do. The weather's getting drier, then fires start, and the invasive grasses kind of provide that fuel that then pushes the fire across the landscape. After a place is burned, it's much more apt to be invaded by the invasive grasses. And so it gets into this positive feedback loop that leads to accelerated invasions of grass and degradation of the habitat. So I think top 2 messages: sage-grouse need high quality, large landscapes, and habitat there are lots of threats to the habitat, including climate change induced drought. So now let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about greater sage-grouse conservation. I started this webinar by saying that the greater sage-grouse has been on the radar screen of many folks for a long, long time. It was first petitioned in 1999, petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. In 2004, the Fish Wildlife Service found that it wasn't warranted for listing. That was challenged in court. The court overturned that. And in doing so, that sort of spurred on a lot of scientific interest and research that then informed Fish and Wildlife Service's next finding, which was in 2010. They found that the greater sage-grouse actually did warrant listing, but it was precluded because there were higher priorities in it. And that happens a fair amount. So they say a species deserves listing, but there's like a list, a to-do list, and it's not going to get attention immediately. But what that 2010 finding did do is it sort of spurred on an unprecedented federal planning process where multiple agencies got together, the BLM, the Fire Service, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, state wildlife agencies, et cetera. And they worked together to try to forge an agreement, to forge sort of a conservation strategy writ large, and then underneath that, resource management plan amendments. Those amendments, there were about 100 land management plans that were amended in 2015 to incorporate these conservation measures that were part of this greater conservation sage-grouse agreement and strategy. And after those plan amendments were finalized, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came out and said that the species no longer warrants listing because there's now good, solid regulatory certainty that these plans will be conserving the sage-grouse. So they don't need to list it. There are other mechanisms now that are taking. But then in 2016, the Trump administration got elected and came into office, and they did a couple of things. They did not fully implement the 2015 agreement. They undid some of the agreement. They amended the plans in 2019. And throughout that period, they really emphasized energy development, oil and gas drilling across the West, but also in greater sage-grouse habitats. And then in 2020, we had another administration shift. And in 2022, the Biden administration announced that it was also going to amend the plans. So this is, I'd like to keep track. This is 3.0. And these amendments are now in process. And that's why we're having this conversation, because the Biden administration in March just published the draft plan amendments and environmental impact statement. So as I said, in 2015, all these agencies came together to craft this larger conservation strategy for the greater sage-grouse, and the Bureau of Land Management amended a lot of plans, these land management plans across the West. These land management plans guide how they manage their lands. They're like the general zoning maps. And so I would just give you a sense of what the conservation strategy and the plan amendments look like that were finalized in 2015. So what BLM did is it basically zoned out the landscape and said, we're going to have priority habitats for greater sage-grouse, and we're going to have general habitats for greater sage-grouse. Those priority habitats were based on places that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a few years earlier had identified and said, these are the places that we think are essential for the long-term viability of the greater sage-grouse. And they were basically based on population data and LEC locations, those meeting area locations. So if you look at this map here, the darker purple is the priority habitats, and the lighter purple pink are the general habitats. Another thing that those 2015 plans did is they established what they called sagebrush focal areas. And these are the areas in green. They might show up on black on your screen. You can sort of see them in the middle of the screen here. I don't know if my mouse, if you can see my mouse. Those were areas, 10 million acres worth, that were identified for a mineral withdrawal from hard rock mining. So the general idea or the general concept underlying these 2015 plans is we'll identify these priority habitats and we will restrict what can happen in those places so that we limit disturbance. Because again, we know that the sage-grouse need large landscapes of healthy habitat with limited disturbance. And so they use this approach that I like to just call the avoid, minimize, mitigate strategy. So we're going to avoid disturbance in those places. If we can't avoid, we're going to minimize it. If we can't minimize it, we're going to mitigate it. And so that was the gist of these 2015 plans. There's obviously a lot of detail, but that gives you the overview. And yes, Trump administration came in and amended these plans, but those amendments actually were enjoined by a court. So the BLM currently is managing under this 2015 plan direction. So big question is, are the 2015 plans working? We're coming into Amendment 3.0 here, the third time amending plans for the greater sage-grouse. And it's really important that we ask, you know, is the 2015 strategy effective? And so we talked earlier about how the populations are doing. There's been 9 years since the 2015 plans were finalized. I would say that in those 9 years, we're not seeing any dramatic turnarounds. Obviously, populations respond in time, but we're still seeing declines over that time period. How are the habitats doing, especially the priority habitats? Well, that's a question that defenders asked, and we did a number of analyses to answer that question. I think I want to start with this map that I put on the screen here. What this map shows are the priority habitats across the greater sage-grouse range. The darker areas, darker purple, show the priority habitats that are currently, according to BLM data, not meeting their land health standards. And the lighter pink area are the places where BLM has never even evaluated whether they're meeting the land health standards or not. So we see about 47% of the priority habitats are failing land health, according to the BLM's most recent land health evaluations, and an additional 24% have never been evaluated. So that's just over 70% of the lands, the priority habitats. These are the places deemed essential for greater sage-grouse long-term viability are clearly not doing well. What we also see is that there are certain places that have also been where certain impacts are more prominent. So if we look at the eastern part of the range, the Rocky Mountain states where energy development is more prevalent, we can see there's been a fair amount of energy development within these priority habitats. This map I just popped up is Wyoming, and you can see that over a period of time, you can see that there have been rights of ways through priority habitats. There have been oil and gas leases sold within priority habitats and oil and gas leases offered in priority habitats. So the question is, what do we need to do? Do we need a new approach? As I said, the 2015 plan was sort of predicated on this idea of we identify these priority habitats and we avoid, minimize, mitigate. So I just pulled these excerpts from some experts to give you a sense of what some of them are saying. Top left corner, this is by Darty et al. Paper, 2022. It was a USGS paper. And they said in this, small incremental changes to the existing amount of conservation delivery and coordination will likely not abate the expected loss in sagebrush ecological integrity, and consequently the loss of sagebrush obligates such as the greater sage-grouse. And I think that's a really important concept. Small incremental changes aren't going to do it. We need something different to curb the decline of the greater sage-grouse and the other sagebrush dependent species out there. On the top right, greater sage-grouse shows a continued steep decline that warrants increased voluntary habitat conservation incentives and renewed stronger federal and state protections from the 2022 State of the Bird Report. So we have these experts who are saying, you know, maybe we need a new approach. We can't just sort of eat around the edges. We might need to rethink this. So here we are. We're at Sage-Grouse Planning 3.0. The Biden administration wants to amend all of those land management plans again for the conservation of the greater sage-grouse and update that sort of that larger agreement, that larger greater sage-grouse conservation strategy. So on March 15th, BLM published the draft Great Sage-Grouse Plan Amendment and Environmental Impact Statement. And they announced two common opportunities. One is May 14th, so coming up in just less than 2 weeks, on the areas of critical environmental concern. Did I get that backwards? AE? No, that's right, ACEC. I'm always messing up these acronyms. Areas of critical environmental concern. I might also call them ACECs, that's what we call them for short. And then in June 13th, is a second comment period on all other components of the Greater Sage-Grouse Plan Amendment and Environmental Impact Statement. So the way BLM does this is they say, here's our proposed alternative, and here are 5 other alternatives in the Environmental Impact Statement that we're going to provide you for comparison. And then in the environmental impact statement, they analyze the impact of their preferred alternative and the impact of the other alternative. So you can see the trade-offs involved in protecting more land or not protecting as much land. So when we look to see what's in the BLM preferred alternative, what we see is it's actually pretty close to the 2015 agreement with tweaks. Some make it weaker, some make it slightly stronger, but it's right in line with where the approach, that avoid, minimize, mitigate approach that was adopted in 2015. Notably, they removed those sagebrush focal areas, those 10 million acres where they had proposed a mineral withdrawal. And they propose a concept in here of areas of critical environmental concern. They propose them, but not in the preferred alternative. So areas of critical environmental concern, 11 million acres worth, are in alternatives 3 and 6, but not in alternative 5, which is the preferred alternative. So now I just want to focus right in on the ACECs because that's the upcoming comment period. So let's talk about them. First off, what are these crazy things, areas of critical environmental concern, ACECs? So these areas are, the ACEC is the primary conservation designation for the Bureau of Land Management. It's actually defined in statute. And this is the definition. Areas within the public lands where special management attention is required to protect and prevent irreparable damage to important historical, cultural, or scenic values, fish and wildlife resources, or other natural systems or processes. Areas of critical environmental concern, the way it works is BLM, the public or BLM itself can nominate these areas of critical environmental concern as part of a resource management planning process or plan amendment process like we're in right now. And when they're nominated, BLM then is supposed to go and evaluate whether the nominated areas or maybe parts of the nominated areas meet the criteria for qualifying as an ACEC. If they meet the criteria, then BLM has to include them in at least one of the alternatives in the environmental impact statement. So we knew this, and in 2022, when BLM started this process, Defenders of Wildlife and 18 other conservation organizations developed and submitted a nomination. The dark green areas are that nomination. We essentially nominated what we call the Sagebrush Sea Reserve ACEC network, which pretty much encompasses those priority habitats that were delineated in the 2015 plan with a few changes. In Wyoming, we had to eliminate some of those priority habitats because they had been too damaged by energy development. And in Nevada, we added some habitats that were more high upland sage-grouse habitats that we thought would become more important with climate change over time. Our nomination is about 48 million acres. So what did BLM do with it? How did BLM treat ACECs in the plan? So what BLM did is they chose not to evaluate our nomination, and instead they looked at the entire planning area and identified all the acres that they felt met those criteria for qualifying an ACEC. And the BLM said, we found 11 million acres that met the ACEC criteria. It's the orange polygons on this map, and proposed them for designation, as I said, in alternatives 3 and 6, but not in the preferred alternative 5. So question is, when we're thinking about the trade-offs between the alternatives, in some of the alternatives, BLM says we're going to have priority habitats like we did before. In some of the alternatives, we're going to have we might have a subset of those that are areas of critical environmental concern. Why is it important to have areas of critical environmental concern? And in particular, why is it important, I think, to have the robust network that we suggested, which pretty much encompasses those areas deemed necessary by the Fish and Wildlife Service for the long-term viability of the greater sage-grouse. I think here are some of the good reasons. The experts are saying we need a change. We can't just eat around the edges. We can't have incremental changes. We need to do something different if we're going to curb the decline of this species. The avoid, minimize, mitigate paradigm, it isn't working. It isn't providing the strong enough protections that we need for these priority habitats. And I think if you remember that map I showed of Wyoming and the energy development and the rights of ways in the priority habitats, that's a good illustration that even though those priority habitats are delineated, development is still occurring within them. And then lastly, ACECs bring funding, resources, and attention. It's even in the definition of an ACEC, an area with notable important resources that needs special management attention. And when we draw those lines on a map, then the public land managers and others bring resources to the table and provide that special management attention in a way that doesn't happen when we just delineate management zones. So, time for ACECs before time runs out for the sage-grouse. Where we have gathered here today to, I hope, write some letters and support the designation of an ACEC network as part of the Greater Sage-Grouse Plan Amendments 3.0. So that's what I want to do with you for the remainder of the time. I can answer questions, and then we can talk about what point should be in those letters. And before I end, I want to put this up. I will copy this when we're having Q&A, and I will put it in the chat so you can have these links. But I'm hoping that these are helpful resources for you as you write your comments or just want to learn more. I alluded earlier in the presentation that defenders had done a fair amount of analyses on the 2015 plans and how well they're working, and we really honed in on the priority habitats. And if you go to the top link there are state-by-state fact sheets that look at the greater sage-grouse habitat in each state and how it's faring under the 2015 management scheme. And then Audrey and I put these sample talking points together. I can keep them up on the screen, perhaps, as we do Q&A. We can copy them into the chat, so you could grab them and on your computer write a letter as we're sitting together. I'm going to hand it over to Audrey to choreograph the next section of this. And I just want to say thank you so much for paying attention. I hope that made sense, and I would love to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Vera. That was awesome information. So like I mentioned, what we're going to do now is give you some time to write comments to submit to the BLM, and then also ask questions to Vera. So you're able to write good, effective comments, and just for your own knowledge and interest in sage-grouse. So the link I'm about to put in the chat is where you can submit your comments. And then also on this link, if you click the Sage-Grouse banner right in the middle of the screen, there is going to be a ton of resources there for you, a sample letter that you can kind of make your own, talking points, additional links. So this link I'm about to send is going to be really valuable for writing your comments. And I'll pull up this link too. So you'll click on that link. It'll say, make your voice heard. Right under that, it says, action alert, tell the BLM it's time for ACECs before time runs out on sage-grouse. You'll click that, and then that's going to be so much information that you can use to write your comment. And on the right of the screen, you can put your comment directly into that text box, put your info in, and press send message, and that'll send it away for you, and you'll have done your job. But there's a couple other ways you can submit comments too, but this might be the easiest one. And you can see there's a sample letter right in the message body. We do really encourage you to make the comment as personal to you as possible. You can include things about sage-grouse that you learned today. You can say what your name is and what state you live in, especially if you're in one of those states that has greater sage-grouse habitat inside of it. It's really valuable for the BLM to hear from you that I live in this state and ACECs are something that I want for sage-grouse in my state. So I will stop there. If you have any questions about technical stuff, like trouble with the link or the submitting comments, you can chat me or raise your hand and let me know. But we'll go right to questions for Vera. And I see a couple in the chat already that all, maybe Vera, if that's okay with you, I can say the questions and then you can go ahead and answer them. Okay. So Teresa asks, what uses like grazing, energy development, recreation, wild horses and burrow management are banned on ACECs?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the management standard for an ACEC is that BLM has to manage it to protect and enhance the resources for which it was designated. So in this case, it was designated, presumably they would be designated for the conservation of the greater sage-grouse and its habitats. So the management should be protecting and enhancing those resources. So BLM sort of customizes as it goes on these ACECs and it will allow uses so long as those the resources that were the reason for designation are not compromised. So when we nominated that our Sagebrush Sea Reserve ACEC network, we provided management direction and said, this is what you should do. So for instance, we were like, you should make exclusions for energy development from mining, because those are big disturbances that sage-grouse won't tolerate. For grazing, we want to make sure that land health standards were being met and that habitat objectives were being met. So grazing could go on, but you need to be looking at it annually and making sure that you're meeting those habitat objectives. So again, recreation, similar kind of thing. If you can manage recreation so that it has a soft impact and it's not in places that are particularly important to sage-grouse, let's say within the LEC buffers, then maybe you can have it compatibly and you can coexist. So it's sort of going through like that. BLM's proposed management of the 11 million acres varies under the two alternatives where they included it. And in one of the alternatives is essentially exactly the same as how they would manage the priority habitats. And which is usually, there's lots of little details, but overall, let's say it's no surface occupancy for energy development. But it's not withdrawing it from mining, for instance. So if somebody put in a mining claim, they could develop. So not as strong as we would like in certain instances. And alternative 6, the ACEC management is less protective than it is under alternative 3. So you sort of have to dive into those details. But I think when we're writing letters, what we want to say is the ACEC management has to be strong enough that sagebrush habitats are improving and sage-grouse populations are improving.
Thank you. Yeah. That's very important to include in comments, and you'll find information on that in that link, like I said, if you want to have specific text to include. Monica says, I noticed that Oregon was left out of BLM's ACEC designation. What happened there? And do you have any suggestions for getting something in Oregon?
I noticed that too. I'll tell you the way BLM identified the 11 million acres that they put in alternatives 3 and 6 is they looked at some habitat studies, some genetic connectivity studies, climate change studies, and identified places that they thought would persist as sagebrush habitats useful for sage-grouse into the future. And so they did a GIS analysis and didn't come up with places in Oregon. I would like to say that I think BLM's approach is reasonable in the sense that BLM basically designed its own nomination, just as we designed our nomination. Our nomination was based a lot more on the lecking locations and bird densities, and theirs took into account some different factors. And in both cases, we designed ACEC nominations. What BLM didn't do well is they didn't evaluate our nomination. They just said ours is the one on the table, and that's what we're going to look at. So let me just put that out there, and then just say for the Oregon, Oregon does have some existing ACECs in sage-grouse habitat that pre-existed the planning process. So that's one thing you should know. And if you want to see ACECs in Oregon, I think it's important that you write a letter, and you can either take the tactic that we've suggested in our talking points, which is you support the Sagebrush Sea Reserve ACEC network that covers is a subset of all the lands in the range. And in particular, I want to see ACECs in Oregon, and this is why. And then write that in your letter.
Yeah, it's if you live in one of these states, like I said, put that in the letter and say that you live there and you want to see ACECs for sage-grouse there. We don't have any more questions in the chat. Does anyone want to unmute and ask a question, or feel free to put a question in the chat? I'll give it a minute or two. Oh, here we go. Okay, Shelly has a great question. I just saw one come in. Okay. Under the 2015 agreement, there was tremendous collaboration among federal, state, tribal, and private entities, which broke down during the Trump era. Under Biden, with management now under the 2015 plan direction, can you describe the status of that collaboration? How can our comments address what BLM can do to better achieve multi-agency collaboration? That's a very good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that 2015 process, yielded, it was unprecedented, and in the amount of parties that participated and the breadth of the landscape they were talking about. And it yielded this conservation strategy. It did break down in the Trump administration because they reneged on a great deal of it, and then for various other reasons. And then as the Biden administration has restarted the planning process to do Amendment 3.0, they have been working very closely with all the state wildlife agencies as cooperators on the process. So in this plan revision, in the 2015 one, the Forest Service was also revising all of its plans where there's sagebrush habitats. And in this one, the Forest Service is not participating. So its lands are not getting considered. But they did work with the state wildlife agencies as cooperators. There's always this tension with the state wildlife agencies because sometimes the states want to find that balance between industrial development and economic interests in their states and protection of wildlife. So it's always an interesting dance between the states and the federal agencies and how they work out these compromises and collaborations. I think it's great that they're all working together, but at the end of the day, I think the biology has to be the determining factor. And we have to look at what are those critical places on the landscape that the greater sage-grouse absolutely need. We know that the leks and areas around those leks, several mile radiuses around those leks are very important. And we've got to minimize fragmentation. We've got to minimize infrastructure development within these important landscapes. And that's just bottom line. And so I think we've got to start with the biology, and then within those constraints, try to figure out the coexistence, how we coexist and how we can have other activities, but maintain those really key elements for the sage-grouse and the other species that are sagebrush occupants.
Thank you. And thank you for the question, Shelley. Any additional questions? Like I said, you can unmute and ask right now if you want. You don't want to type it out, but I'll give a minute or two for final questions.
So I'll just say it's really, really helpful for people to write letters. It's really helpful to have customized letters. Those individual comments often the agencies will regard the identical letters, more as one petition or one comment as opposed to individual comments. And when people actually take the time to write a customized comment, it really, it gets their attention and they regard it with a different weight. And so I fully encourage it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we have the sample comment already in the message body at the link I sent, and you can put in your information and press send on that, but it's much more powerful for you to edit that and make it your own. Like Vera said, sometimes the identical comments submitted by multiple people are counted as one comment, but it's more powerful to have lots of comments.
I see that question. If you use the given language and then you customize, yes, it will count as an individual comment, and that's what you should do. You shouldn't have to make up the whole thing, but certainly you could put the points in and then add a paragraph or two, or you can modify the text of the points, however you want to do it. But as long as you individualize it, they'll count it separately.
Yes. And then I think Natalie Taylor spoke up with a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering how much of the body needed to be changed before it was considered personal and different or customized.
Well, if you can add a paragraph about, and it can be just
That's
personalized,
enough.
like this is why I care.
Yeah.
I go out to the sagebrush sea and I have seen sage-grouse, and it was a completely meaningful experience to me. And I'm going to tell you why. And this is why it's so important to me that we've got to make sure that this species persists and becomes stable in the future. Something like that. I think that's the kind of thing,
Good, because I customize almost every letter, but I think, well, AI is probably checking these things, and I wonder how many of the paragraphs that are repeated, do you need to get past the computer?
Right.
I want to make those great points, but thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that you customize them. And this is, that's something that you all can take to future comments that you write for these public comment periods. Customizing them and adding why this is important to you and what you've learned about it is always going to be more impactful.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? We have a couple minutes left. Okay, I'll wrap up. Vera, thank you so much for being here with us today. Like I said, I'm so lucky to have you as a friend and a mentor. And I'm really glad that we worked together at Defenders, and now we're working together here with me at Broad. So this information was amazing. And I hope that everyone who attended is submitting a comment. If you haven't done it already, that's okay. That link that I sent is going to be active until the comment period closes on May 14th. And you can access that just by going to the Great Old Broads website and going to the Action Center under the Take Action link. And with that, I will let you all go. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Audrey. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.